Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Anthony Abraham Jack and Jeff Selingo. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for tonight's introductions. Jeff Selingo is a familiar presence in FANland. We have had the pleasure of hosting him for both Zoom and in-person events in 2020, 2021, and 2022. He is a New York Times bestselling author of 3 books on education and the job market. For more than 25 years, his in-depth reporting and storytelling have provided practical insight about the future of higher education and the workforce to university leaders, corporate executives, as well as students and parents. His latest book, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, is so fabulous. And he is working on his next book about how we need to look at good colleges beyond the top of the rankings, which is due out in late 2025. I'm predicting you'll see Jeff in about a year from now. He is co-host of the podcast Future You and writes an excellent biweekly newsletter, Next, which I definitely recommend. Joining Jeff tonight, Anthony Abraham Jack was FAN's guest in 2019 for a powerful keynote event in support of his book, The Privileged Poor: How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students. He is the inaugural faculty director of the Newberry Center and associate professor of higher education leadership at Boston University. His research documents, that was the wrong stress on that sentence. His research documents, there we go, the overlooked diversity among lower income undergraduates, the doubly disadvantaged, those who enter college from local, typically distressed public high schools, and the privileged poor, those who do so from boarding, day, and prep high schools. His work has appeared in many outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Times Higher Education, and on NPR and CNN. Now let's welcome both Tony Jack and Jeff Selingo back to FAN.
Lonnie, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's so great to have 2 of my favorite people here, Lonnie and Tony Jack. Although Tony and I just discovered, even though we've done events like this before, we've actually never met in person, which is like the modern version here of meeting, I guess, is over Zoom. But Tony, great to see you. Great to have FAN bring us together. FAN is one of my favorite organizations in the world, which is one of the reasons why I love to come back either as an author or as an interviewer in this position tonight. I just think they bring together some of the best authors and ideas that are kind of at the forefront of what we're discussing today. And so, Tony, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, great to be here. And I want to echo that. I'll never forget coming to Evanston and being at Northwestern and that cathedral for my first fan event. This was, yeah, so I'm so happy and honored to be back in conversation with this community.
That's so we're here to talk about Class Dismissed tonight, your newest book. And can you talk a little bit about how did you think about this book building on the work of that book that you did talk about in Evanston, which was The Privileged Poor? How is it the same? How is it different?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this book kind of was inspired by 2 things. One, the moment that we were in, right? We were in a very tumultuous moment. COVID had shut campuses down, and something was really gnawing at me in how presidents and reporters were talking about students. It was almost as if they were discovering the inequality in their lives, right? It was like, did you know our students don't have internet? Did you know our students don't have this? Some of our students are homeless. I'm like, you know, the number of students who have their mailing and their permanent address at university, mail services, right? You know who you admit. But it's also part of the problem. They think that sometimes once admission hits, they can wipe their hands of all the things that students need in their lives. And so I was, like just hearing all this reporting. And I remember writing, I was like, you have to realize something that for so many of these students, closures is yet another eviction and yet another pink slip in their life, right? They already come from places that were quite unstable because of economic uncertainty, where they're living with their neighborhoods, sometimes family dynamics, and sometimes a combination thereof. And our universities were not really grappling with that. The second part is there was a chapter in The Privileged Poor that kind of got on the cutting room floor. The Privileged Poor focuses on life on campus, and it kind of wants to understand how the students' trajectories to college shape how they move through college. Class Dismissed takes a slightly different approach in the sense that it wants to show just how life outside the college gates directly influence what happens every day on campus. In some respects, I hope that the book actually demolishes and pushes us to never use again the term campus bubble. I hope that this book allows us to think about retiring that term, because if the campus is truly a bubble, it is a porous one, especially for the most vulnerable students, because the phone calls, the text messages, the posts, the tweets that students get from home, let alone the everyday responsibilities they owe to their families, they never escape that just because they're now sitting behind these wrought iron gates. And so those two things, to me, those two things really and truly influence my approach to Class Dismissed. Is now we had made some tremendous progress with Privileged Poor, right? Privileged Poor has inspired more than 85 colleges to change their dining hall policies during spring break. Because before the book, many of these universities actually shut down their campuses during spring break, assuming that all students go for fun in the sun. And yet, for generations, students were going hungry during those days. As one student said, they can chart hungry days on their calendar without fail. We had done some work to get these universities to change their policies. Harvard changed theirs, Smith changed theirs, right? A lot of places were actually doing some of the work. But when it came to looking at a broader picture rather than like responding to specific things that I identified, that's where colleges kind of lost their imagination and their ability to think beyond what kind of like was highlighted in a text. And so I was hoping that we can really surface the really entrenched inequalities that never leave students' lives just because they're on campus. And that's what I hope this book does.
So, Tony, you mentioned kind of the reaction to the privileged poor and what some of these colleges and universities did. What was the reaction to colleges and universities so far? I know it's still early, but to Class Dismissed, is it, oh, that was COVID, it's over, we moved on, or do you feel like they realize what has happened in this trauma? And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, this trauma that happened to students, and they want to either be prepared for the next time something like this happens, but even more so, change, like, are policies changing in the same way, or do you think is the reaction similar or different than privileged poor?
It is early, but I think it's actually more similar, because what was important to me about this book is to not let it be just a book about COVID, right? Just about 2020 and 2021, right? My entire focus on this book was to show how COVID exacerbated the very inequalities that universities were ignoring. Like, I was very intentional about exploring specific aspects of students' life and to really just really show, like, hey guys, it was really bad before, it got really worse during COVID, and this hurry up, quick back to normal, like let's get back to the reality that we wish existed, not that actually exists, just swept so much of that back under the rug, except students were more vulnerable than before. And I'll give you an example. In the book, I show that when campuses shut down, we had the assumption that all students stopped working, right? Working on campus and campus jobs and things like that. Okay, a lot of people actually believe that, but that actually wasn't true. Certain jobs stopped, but others continued. So if you were part of a research team, if you were part of a teaching team, like a research assistant, teaching assistant, or course assistant, you were more likely to continue working because professors kept working,
Right.
professors kept teaching. However, if you were working barista or custodial or janitorial, your job officially did stop. What I show in the book is that long before COVID, there was a class segregated labor market on college campuses. Middle class and upper middle class students were more likely to be in what I call life of the mind positions, right? Working with faculty, working with administrators. Lower income students, because they felt more comfortable with jobs that required simple application, like literally what you fill out on an application. They didn't feel comfortable smoozing with faculty, like, hey, can I take you to lunch and learn what you're doing? And then somehow ask for a job in your lab. They were less comfortable doing that. So many of the positions that were life of the mind were more handed out in office hours, like like Halloween on like candy on Halloween, right? You have to go there, knock on the door, introduce yourself, schmooze, and then ask for the job. But then when you pull it back, they were more like, well, no, I'm going to work dorm crew, which is janitorial. I'm going to work barista. I'm going to work food services. And so when actually COVID hit, lower income students who worked to to put money back home, as
Their
one
jobs
student,
disappeared.
their jobs completely disappeared. As Kevin said, right, he worked to manage that uncertainty. I'll never forget that, manage the uncertainty of home, right? He did that to keep the fridge, if not full, at least not empty. When COVID hit, his job stopped. Versus those students who served as research assistants, they kept working. As a matter of fact, two things happened. Not only did they keep working, but faculty and administrators fought for them to actually have more hours than normal because they needed more help transitioning to Zoom, doing their research virtually. So the students who needed less, at least financially, got more support and more hours. The students who needed more got less, right? And so it deepened the very inequality that was already bad on campus, but no one was paying attention to it. Universities take such a hands-off approach to helping students find jobs using websites like Handshake and letting faculty just run their own hiring services, which is as varied as the faculty are. It left the most vulnerable student outside, on the outside looking in at students who had certain positions.
And do you feel like universities really didn't understand this, that they had this kind of class system set up around jobs? And I guess the question is, now that this has been kind of exposed through your book, do you feel like the pandemic helped them really understand the lived experiences of the students that they admit? As you said, right? Faculty were shocked that some of their students were homeless, for example. Do you feel that they now have a better understanding of the students that they admit, or do you feel like we're just right back where we were in 2019 in terms of their understanding of that?
To be honest, I think we're kind of a little bit back to where we were before, because again, some universities, took action and say, oh, we're going to pay out your federal work study, or we're going to pay out certain things. But I wanted to expose something deeper than just who lost money and who didn't during COVID. I wanted to expose how unequal the system is on college campuses on who gets jobs, right? Why are most privileged students, those who are the children of faculty, the children of doctors, the children of lawyers, if they work on campus, they are more likely to be in these jobs that, yes, pay a wage, but they offer a different form of capital, right? Who gets those letters of recommendation, invitation to internships, to apply for internships, introductions to coveted events, right? Who gets access to all those things? Well, people who typically have relationships with faculty and administrators. So I want to move beyond. I almost want to use the money as kind of like a gateway item to talk about something that's a deeper seated problem. And that is the fact that you have this stratified system of who gets jobs because of how much of a hands-off approach you take. Now, I have learned that the University of Nebraska, for example, at Omaha, instituted a policy where all jobs on campus now that are subsidized by the university has to go through the central website and office for employment.
So everybody sees it.
Everybody sees them. Now, even if we know that there will still be screening, there will still be selection bias on the other end, right? Where people select people who look like them, think like them, talk like them, vacation like them. But at least one part is now universal. That's huge, right? That's a big step. And that's a model in which I think we can follow, that other universities, especially larger universities and the more selective universities, because there's more to lose and to gain at those two institutions. At larger institutions, because, so for example, at Harvard and Amherst, one faculty member can hire 20 students in their lab. But in the faculty to student ratio is so small that really most students can find a job if they want to. But if you're talking about at a school like the University of Texas, University of Nebraska, right, Kansas State, where faculty are far outnumbered by the students, access to those type of jobs that give you letters of recommendation or give you insight into career paths that you did not know before, I think it has that simple change to universalize where jobs are posted and mandate that those jobs are posted there could fundamentally change access to who gets those jobs.
Right. And they just don't, I meet so many students as well. They just don't know how to navigate the
No.
institution because nobody assists them, tells them, right? So we know this is a problem, Tony, right? You have exposed it in the privileged poor. You've now exposed it in class dismissed. Like, what is the hurdle to change here? Like, what these institutions know what they need to do, I would assume. Why aren't they doing it?
Well, I mean, I think it's also a misunderstanding. I wouldn't say a misunderstanding. I think I'm being too kind. It's like a lack of understanding of the class dynamics that actually happen on campus. Because, so for example, I'm a sociologist and I take approach to say, okay, like who has access to different forms of cultural capital, right? Who has access to that insider knowledge of how to navigate these institutions, and realizing that just how baked those notions are into our policies. And so in some respects, they are ignoring those class dynamics because they would say, well, if we have a website like Handshake, then everything is good. Like it's universalized. No, because you didn't do the other work of making sure that all the jobs are actually on there. And two, just because you can lead a horse to water doesn't mean that horse is going to drink, right? You have to be, and I think this is also part of the problem. Universities who recruit lower income and first generation college students only want to go so far in helping students navigate campus because they believe they should be more independent and go on their own. And I understand that kind of desire. But if your campus has a language that is classed, loaded, and coded, right? There's very little wiggle room for lower income students trying to navigate that because, as I said in my first book, some students think office hours are a time for faculty to do their work. And some students know that office hours are a time that faculty set aside specifically for students. Office hours are a space where faculty become advisors, advisors become mentors, and mentors become sometimes employers. If you don't know how the system works, then you don't know how to play the game. Universities just think that they just need to give financial aid and everything will be okay. Or present an
exactly.
option.
And so could we stop there for a second? Because I think this is an important point. There was a piece you probably saw in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago about Bloomberg philanthropies, right? They've given a lot of money to highly selective colleges to raise the number of first generation and low income students. And many of those colleges have not met their goals. And some of that is the colleges will say, well, we've given money, right? We meet full need. We give them money that students need. But what you're saying here, and I think what you've done in both of your books, is to show the needs are so much greater than just money, and also money, by the way, for tuition, room, and board. Right? There's a more financial need out there than you think. But secondly, there's all of these other pieces of the university and college experience, that I'm even shocked sometimes. When I interview presidents or faculty members, I always ask them to tell me their own stories. And you'll be surprised. There's not as many as there probably used to be, but there's a lot of faculty members and even presidents who are first in their family to go to college. And it's almost like they forgot, right? It's almost like the memory holes, right? Where they don't even remember their own experience, and they are kind of now in this bubble. So I guess the question is like, what do you think institutions should do or can do to really expand beyond just meeting financial need? Like,
Yeah.
what are the couple, if you had a president in the room right now, what are the 1, 2, or 3 things you would say, here's what you have to do if you're really committed to this?
Yeah. Well, I want to say one thing first. Like, if you have a PhD, you are 12 to 25 times more likely to have a parent who has a PhD. So yes, there may be individual pockets of a few presidents who identify as first gen or who grew up in low income families, but the vast majority of the professoriate is the professoriate is a generational position, right? In the same way, like doctors and dentists and veterinarians, right? There's a hereditary nature to this job. So that's something that we also have to contend with, right? The diversification of the faculty and the administration, and specifically administrators who are in positions of power, right? I don't mean the assistant director of this diversity office who is oftentimes the go-to person for students on campus, the most overworked person, but the person who has the least amount of power to change policies. I'm talking about the provost, the president, deans of colleges, and stuff like that, right? We're still talking about a lot of this kind of inertia of like this again, 12 to 25 times more likely than the average American to have a PhD parent. One of my biggest things in the book, and in my work more generally, is I would say 2 things. One, when people think about class, I want them to, when people think about money and financial aid, I want to say, take a step back. I want you to think about class as both a material condition and a symbolic one. I want you
Can
to
you
think
talk
about
about the differences between those two?
yeah. When I say material, that means just hard money. That's just the academic way of just saying hard money. Material, it means money. Like how much money do you have? But when I say symbolic, I mean that cultural capital. I think we need to fundamentally assess the way in which we abide by this hidden curriculum, right? The system of unsaid rules and unwritten expectations that we allow to dictate who gets access to university resources. That is, to me, I don't want to, I almost don't want to give specific directives to the university because then they don't move beyond they see it as a directive and they check a box. I want to put universities and college presidents on a path of discovery of how class works on campus. And the second part to that is I think, especially for college presidents, and I would even say boards of trustees who are even more detached from stuff that's happening on the ground, we fundamentally need to understand the landscape of inequality in America. And I'm not saying because we need to ignore international students or students from other countries, but we don't really understand the landscape of inequality in America. Because when you talk to students from rural backgrounds, and in the book, I should say, I interviewed 125 Asian, Black, Latino, white, mixed, and Native students from high income and low income families. And when you talk to a student who comes from a reservation, who comes from a rural background, who comes from a city that has lost jobs over the past 2 generations, each of them talk about how the university fails them in a slightly different way because of not understanding that history, because of not understanding their present position. The part that this really stood out to me the most, and probably was the biggest surprise in the book for me, was what universities require of students who are mandated to take an academic leave.
Talk more about
So many of the quote unquote things that if a student is put on academic leave, let me start this way. If a student wants to take a voluntary leave, they simply send an email to their dean and say, hey, I'm not coming back next semester. I'll be back next fall. See you. They can go and do whatever they want. If a student is mandated to put on leave, and I would say most of the times it happens because they're struggling with the responsibilities of home and the new role of student. Because sometimes it clashes, and oftentimes it does, and it does so at more, depending on the time of year, really. If you go to a school like Harvard, you and you put on leave, you have to go back home with no, you know, the university basically like no longer has responsibility for you. So you lose your insurance, you lose all kinds of different things. But to come back, you have to work a full-time job and take classes at a local university. Other schools require your boss, who you have to take a full-time job, to write two people in your community must then write 2 letters of recommendation for your readiness to return. How are students who are from reservations or from lower income community where 50% of the people have access to jobs, how are you supposed to comply to that?
Yeah.
Not everybody has access to universities in their backyard, right? Think about the fact that if you are put on leave, you then have to tell someone who you don't know at your job, hey, I need a letter because I did not do what I was supposed to do, or I'm somehow a failure at my school, and I need you to assess if I'm ready to come back. You are effectively asking someone to divulge very personal, very sensitive information. And even a fundamental question, even if there are jobs in your community, are they the jobs that a university will count? Because I know there was one student who struggled to find jobs and she ended up working at Walgreens. Are you going to count that? Or do you have in mind that a student must have a white collar kind of internship style position? Right? If we don't understand where students come from and the context of where students come from, something as like hidden, right, from major conversations like university leave policies, they become this extra burden and sometimes insurmountable obstacle to return. Now, I'm showing that in relation to just one tiny aspect of the academic life, and that's leave policies. I use that to speak to larger things about how we understand how students relate to home while they are on this 4-year journey through school.
Yeah, and I think many, not to defend these universities at all, Tony, I just think that most of these policies grew up over time. Nobody ever really looks at them who needs to, and they just keep proliferate over time. But I want to talk about the types of colleges that and universities that we're focused on here. You mentioned earlier the University of Nebraska at Omaha, I believe, right? We know, for example, from the work of Opportunity Insights that, there's a number of public universities like the CUNY system and Cal State that have really high mobility rates for students who are underrepresented in higher ed. And, are we, you have right over your shoulder there, you have Amherst, right? Are we, and, we're in the same week, the US News and World Report rankings came out, right? And everybody wants to know who's in the top 5, who's in the top 10, who's in the top 25. Are we too focused on what the top 25 universities are doing for all students, but particularly for underrepresented students, when it may be that CUNY and Cal State and all these other universities are eons ahead in terms of serving students in a better way, and that we should start to raise them up? Now, I know we have discussed this previously because we also know the outcomes of highly selective universities are great, and they're even better for students who are underrepresented there. But we know from research, again, that CUNY and Cal State, there are a number of universities that are both accessible, excellent, and have great outcomes.
And are way more affordable.
And they're more affordable. As part of this we just need to stop talking about Harvard and Amherst and whatever and start talking about these others? Or do we have to also make these others better?
I think we have to do both, right? Because we're not talking about just the elite schools, just talking about just the elite schools, right? We're talking about the democratization of professions. We're talking about the diversification of a whole host of things that come after, right? I mean, think about the way in which, like you said, like who's on the Supreme Court, Fortune 500 companies, who goes into professions like at Northwestern University, like Lauren Rivera's work pedigree, like really shows how when you look at investment banking, consulting, and other highly lucrative firms, industries, institution matters, and especially who access to those jobs. I think we need to understand the experience of students who do go to our larger state schools, our even regional campuses, and different things like that. Absolutely, I don't think it can be either or. But and maybe I'm putting on my sociology hat here, but I have to say this. I'm a sociologist that is interested in how inequality and poverty shapes the life chances of children and youth. If we only study poverty in poor places, we are missing on the true understand we are limiting our understanding of how inequality gets reproduced in America. And so for me, the reason why I study the schools that I study is because it's not because they're highly selective. It's because they were adopting no loan financial aid policies, doubling the number of Pell eligible or low income and first generation college students. And I wanted to understand what were their experiences, right? I use these institutions as like kind of my laboratory to say, okay, we know that being a commuter undercuts graduation. Yeah. These are residential campuses. We know that living off campus in any kind of way, whether it's an apartment that's across the street, undermines. So I'm looking at I'm creating as experimental of a condition as possible, so I can study how social class shape how students move through college, and using that to extrapolate. The point that's important to make is this: if you look at the larger groups, the schools that you mentioned, like CUNY, and we should look at the work of Jennifer Morton's, like moving up without losing your way. Those schools do absolutely much better at like increasing cohorts, mobility. But the surer shot to graduation, the more selective the school, the surer the shot. And that's because it's more support, more resources, more and less, and they remove a lot of the hurdles. Now, granted, I didn't say that they made it easier. I didn't say that there weren't scars on that path to graduation. And I think by studying these schools, we are able to outline how pernicious these policies are throughout higher education.
I want to talk a little bit about elite schools because they've been in the news the last couple of weeks. We've seen in recent weeks the results of the first incoming class at the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons and the Ivy plus all the big liberal arts and other selective universities. The first incoming class after the Supreme Court ruled that colleges and universities cannot consider an applicant's race in admissions. And the results are all over the place, as you've probably been reading. The proportion of first-year students from underrepresented groups, particularly Black students, declined at most of the elite colleges that previously had considered race. The declines were greater at some institutions than others. Again, we should definitely pay attention to these numbers. It's hard to really know what a trend is in 1 year, but what do you make of these? What do you make of these numbers?
It is interesting. We knew that there were going to be changes, and we knew there were going to be, I hate calling them dips because these are actually people's lives. We know there were going to be declines, but we didn't know how big the decline was going to be. I actually think that what we are seeing is, for example, which universities had a heavier reliance on SAT, and especially quantitative skills that connects to STEM. And so I think that what we are actually seeing is the schools that had the biggest kind of wobble in this moment right now was actually probably those who were probably relying on SAT and other quantitative measures more, because we actually know that is more of a reflection of the larger inequality in the country, right? Who has access to, you know, the SAT tutoring, AP scores, I mean AP tests, and all those kind of things, right? When you think about the geography of inequality, and I would be very interested to see, in looking at the what the classes look like and what the College Board's landscape tool told us about where they were coming from.
Could you
And
just
looking,
describe for our audience what that landscape tool is? I'm happy to do it, or you can do it.
yeah, I mean, for me, I'll put it in a lay term, right? The landscape tool is College Board's a way of showing, basically on a relative scale, like where students' high schools land on a scale from like very, very impoverished to very, very resourced, right?
And just so our audience knows that admissions officers, as they're reading applications, get to see this tool so they know more about the high school. Because again, the admissions officer is now not allowed to see what the student's race or ethnicity is.
Yeah. And so you get an understanding. And the way how I describe it is, it doesn't show you, the college landscape tool does not level the playing field, but it does show you just how unequal it is. And so it'll be very interesting to see the ways in which perhaps that tool could be more effective or more effectively used going forward, especially as schools kind of recalibrate in what they're doing. Now, what I also think is actually quite interesting in this moment that we're saying right now is the now renewed threats that colleges are facing regarding, some declines or stagnant numbers for Asian Americans. Now, I find this a very interesting thing because it assumed that the only people who benefited from affirmative action were black applicants. And it totally ignored the diversity within the Asian American population and also a whole host of things. And so I think we're going to be in this kind of tumultuous moment for a while. Now, I will say this, one thing that I have been annoyed that has not been part of the conversation, and partly it's because there is no data for this right now, is this. We know that the number of Black applicants declined. I'm very much interested in two things about the Black students who were admitted. What was the class breakdown, and what was the ethnic breakdown? Because those are two questions that we are not asking right now. And I would love to hear the same thing for Asian applicants as well. Because we know that the universities were trying to diversify their class on a whole host of dimensions. But the fact that we did not pay attention to the fact that there is racial and ethnic diversity within the Black population, and how immigration status, especially like first generation Caribbean, first generation African born in the US, I want to know how did those cohorts come to be? How are they making up right now? That's something I am very much interested in.
Tony, we don't have a ton of time left, so I want to come back to COVID and the book Class Dismissed for a minute. It really seems to me, I sometimes I'm talking to people and we try to remember what happened 4 years ago, right? It seems right after COVID, kind of colleges flipped the switch and they welcome students back to campus just like it was 2019, without kind of recognizing the trauma of the pandemic on teenagers and families. Is there something different you think higher ed or education in general, because I think this happened in K through 12 as well, should have done to kind of reorient these students back into the system? Or is there something that should be done now given the real long tail of the pandemic? Because as we know, the students coming into higher ed now, they were in high school, middle school. Like, we're going to be living with this for a very long time. And again, I just feel like most talking to those presidents that you were talking about earlier, they're just like, oh, thank God we're back. Let's get going.
Yeah, I think this rush to normalcy, it felt like people were really doing it because they didn't want to see declines in applications anymore. It really felt to me that they were just like, hey, we're open for business. Come. It's almost like you ever see those signs outside of restaurants that say open during construction? That's what it felt like to me. And as I say in the book, right, this rush to normalcy is a rush back to inequality, right? This rush back to an unequal campus, because instead of trying to set new traditions and new policies that truly makes the campus accessible, we simply just was like, no, let's go back to normal. Let's go back to what we had. But what we had was so unequal. What we had was so backwards when it came to certain policies. And so for me, I think we missed out on a moment to fundamentally change how we approach how we support students. There were some places that, made valiant efforts to help students through their transition. I think about Muhlenberg College and how they create these advisor communities. And so one person was responsible for a small cluster, and it was like it was just like more people were being supported. But I just don't know like where we are right now, because now the shift is like, oh, let's have conversations about civility and community, and not about still addressing the underlying inequality that's going to make students have separate and unequal experiences in school.
And by the way, maybe not only did we talk about those numbers at selective colleges around post Supreme Court, but we didn't even get into, and I don't want to get into it here because I want to talk a little bit more about how you wrote the book, but the FAFSA debacle this past
Yes.
year, right? So the federal student aid application, which was incredibly delayed, and then the rollout of this new FAFSA, which by the way was supposed to increase access, but in the end probably decreased access
Yes.
for students, also not a good sign. But I want to ask you about the book. Just going back to the book for a minute, because I really love this book because it's not your typical academic book, right? It's really, you have this narrative approach that I felt was incredibly engaging. Why did you decide to tell it in this way? How did you decide which stories to highlight? And what's been the reaction for an academic like yourself, right? Publishing with an academic press, to write a book like this, which I just think is incredibly accessible.
Well, I appreciate that coming from you. I mean, when the New York Times invites you to review someone's book, like, and then they actually give you such compliments like that, I really appreciate it. Look, I have a general rule when it comes to writing. If my mama can't read it, I don't want to write it. Right? My mom is a high school educated person. She'll pick up a book every once in a while. I That's my rule, right? A proud moment for me is not just writing the book, but being able to hand it to my mom and she can open it and read the introduction. That's for me, right? I don't want to alienate the very people who I write for and about. And I'll tell you a quick story. The proudest moment that I had in the book in writing The Privileged Poor was when a student shared that as a graduation gift, she and her family all did a book read of The Privileged Poor. And her mom, after they read it, her mom looked at her and said, Miha, now I understand. This student had gone through her bachelor's degree, a first master's, and a second master's. And I was the first person she ever felt comfortable attending office hours with. I wear that both with a sense of pride and also like shame for my entire profession.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because why is a student now on her third degree, but it's the first time in office hours? What are we not doing to invite these students in? I don't want my words to do that. I want my words to both invite a student in. I want that student to feel seen. And I want that parent, that professor, or that president to understand their students when they read my work, right? I hope that when people read Kevin's story or Sophia's story or even Hannah's story, that they were like, I know Sophia.
Somebody like that.
I
Yeah.
don't know that Sophia, but I know the Sophia in my life. And I understand now a little bit more about what she's going through. And I will say also in the book is organized around students' families, finances, and the fault line along race. And that was important to me because I wanted to anchor people in the story and say, like, this is going to be an exploration through how they navigated COVID, but really how they navigated so many years before that. And getting to your previous question, right? I'm showing you the experience of the students who you are now admitting. Because these students were in college during COVID, right? Who I interviewed. But all that I'm showing you is also showing you what the next generation or two of students, cohorts of students, are going to be bringing with them. Because their neighborhoods have not gotten back to normal. There are so many reservations that will never recover from the loss of life, let alone the loss of resources, let alone the loss of life that happened during that time. Right? There are places that are still haven't seen the job bounce back. I want to make sure that when you read this, you understand the situation that your policies are creating.
Well, and it sounds like also, Tony, that the policies have to even be more inclusive, more accessible, because if things haven't bounced back since COVID, you have to actually go above and beyond what you even did in 2019, 2020.
Well, what
As
we
a
did
policy,
during that
right?
time was really just like just try to give out more money and give temporary fixes, right? It's not like, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that universities in this country, even though some of them are the biggest gentrifiers, cannot fix the legacy of redlining and blockbusting and land theft and stuff like that, but they can account for it in their policies.
Yeah. You mentioned you reported this starting during COVID. I'm just kind of curious. How did you go about your research for it? What was easier or more difficult than you expected?
I'll be honest with you, I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get students to talk to me. Like you said, you've interviewed presidents and deans and professors. Like, I'm a person who I want to sit in the office with you. I want to, I want to be in the moment with you. I want to be able to read your body language. I want to be able to joke with you both before and after. I want to put you at ease. And I thought it was sometimes that the Zoom atmosphere was a little bit too clinical,
Yeah.
but it wasn't. Students really opened up, partly because they were feeling isolated, partly because, some students hadn't known who I was because of the first book. And, they were like, oh, we read it in class and I would love to be part of the study. They really opened up. And so it really, I think, the interviews lasted 2.5 hours on average, 125 students, 2.5 hours each student. Although one student, the interview lasted 9 hours. It was just like this. There was bonding that was happening over the importance of sharing one story. And that was what was important to me, is to make students feel empowered to tell their stories, because they did. And they talked about things that I never thought. Students revealed things in their first interview to me that it took them months or even years to tell their therapist. And so it was like these very, very real conversations that I truly appreciated. And I hope that the narrative storytelling that I try to do, even to the chagrin sometimes of some people in my discipline, really allows their stories to eventually move the needle towards a more equitable campus.
You said to the chagrin of some people in your discipline. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think some people think that the more accessible the work, the less academically rigorous it is. And I fundamentally don't believe that. I mean, whether you're reading Bell Hooks or Du Bois or no, people, like, the more people who can read it, grapple with it, be angered by it, be felt supported by it, the more potential it has to actually affect change. And that, to me, is why I got into this. I didn't get into this. I got into it for two reasons. One, I like the poofy hats and the robes that PhDs get when they graduate. But I also I'm like, now that we know what we know, what are we going to do about it?
So that brings me to my last question. Now that we know, what are we going to do about it? What don't we know yet? What do you feel like you started to scratch the surface of that you wanted to do? As you said, even when you did the privileged poor, there was that that chapter that was left on the cutting room floor. Every book, I think, gives you ideas for more books. Not putting you on the spot here to do another book, but because I know I'm working on one and I'm not quite sure I want to do another one after this. But what areas do you feel like someone, whether that's you or somebody, should dig deeper on after this?
I really want people, and this may sound like so counterintuitive, but I want people to show the big effects of small policies. Right? I want people like when again, I'm just absolutely fascinated that we looked at 75 schools leave policies and just the range. There was only one school, Georgetown, that actually had a positive framing about taking time off for, after a breakdown or after a forced academic leave. And that's that. And I'm just trying to figure out what other things are happening in like the basement level or the first floor of the deans of student offices around the country that are really handicapping and crippling lower income first generation college students, and then expand it to like international students and stuff like that. And I'm just wondering what else is left to be uncovered, because I may focus on this one particular thing, but there are some other policies that I don't know about, that I didn't come across because it wasn't the moment. I think there's a lot of stuff that, and again, framing it as this bigger conversation, you can study a small policy, but it has such a huge impact on how the college operates.
Yeah. I think Lonnie's coming back. Here she is.
Boy, Jeff and Tony, thank you so much for such an enlightening and provocative conversation. Jeff, we know we can always count on you to be very prepared and thoughtful in your questions to folks. And Tony, man, you give both in the book, in your conversations, keynotes, everything, you just put so much on people's minds, and we're so grateful that you've spent some more time here with FAN and our community. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I want to remind everyone that both Jeff and Tony will be at After Hours, which will start at 8:05 p.m. Central in about 10 minutes from now. Jeff and Tony have resent you your After Hours links, so they should be near the top of your inboxes. How do you get to come to After Hours? You can buy a copy of Class Dismissed from our partner bookseller. We've been putting in the link in chat all night. Anne Marie's going to throw it in there one more time. Come get a copy. The registration link for After Hours is in the email receipt from the store. Come to After Hours, and FAN will then gift a second copy of the book to everyone at After Hours who would like one. It's an incredible opportunity. It's a 2-for-1. Spend your money one time. You get like 50% off on 2 books. What's not to love about that? And I just am positive that you must know, whether it is a high school, college counselor, it could be anybody. It could be a relative. It could be a colleague at work who will absolutely benefit from reading this book. So come hang out at After Hours. Plenty more conversation there to be had. I'm going to pose a quick question here, Tony. We have about 3 minutes left. And Jeff, you might want to chime in a little bit too. My guess is you're on top of this as well. And it gets to, it's from Patricia, and she's asking, what about the impact of the FAFSA disaster on the outcomes of the first year class? There may have been some thousands of students who did not think their families could navigate through the process in time. And of course, the news coming out again on FAFSA just today in a couple days is like, hi, round 2 of crazy again for this year. Everything's going to be late and everything's going to be a mess again. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tony? I realize your book was probably done at a certain point or mostly written when a lot of that was unfolding, but do you have thoughts that you want to offer about the whole FAFSA financial aid application process?
I will say this: any hiccup, detour, disruption in the application process is going to fundamentally shape the pathways for our most vulnerable students. Like think about back 10 years, we were trying to do what was President Obama's shorthand for the cost of attendance, right? We were trying to think about
sheet, right?
the shopping sheet, yeah. Like we were trying to simplify as much as possible. So there is no surprise why something like this will fundamentally shape the number of students especially from the most vulnerable groups who are applying to schools or who are then attending schools that were able to say, we're going to give you this regardless.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I just think, Lonnie, that the ironic thing here is this was supposed to be the FAFSA simplification. It was actually supposed to increase the number of students filing the FAFSA and getting
Yeah.
financial aid, and it did just the opposite.
Yeah, it's terrible. I look forward to more in about 5 minutes. We're just about 30 seconds out. Jeff, again, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for spending time with FAN tonight. Tomorrow night, Jamil Zakian and Robert Sapolsky. That's going to be a pretty hopping conversation as well. So come hang out with us again. More to come. Thanks for your time. And we'll see both of you in about 5 minutes at After
Thank you.
Hours.
Thank you, Fan, and thank you, Lonnie, and thank you, Tony.
Thank y'all so much.